Hi, I'm Druti Shah, and this is my podcast, Have You Thought About? I'm a writer and I love to find out about what passions people are pursuing, especially if they're managing to blend together their skills in unusual ways. In each edition, I'm going to chat with someone I find particularly interesting and who's managed to fit things together in their life or profession that you don't always think of as an obvious match. You're about to hear me chatting with Corey Brotherson, an award-winning freelance writer and creative consultant. Corey, hello. Now, we met thanks to some serendipity of seating at the Ochre conference, a special dinner, and what Ochre does is focus on entertainment, creating significant impact. And that is what you do. You create some pretty significant impact with the multitude of work that you've already got behind you. But for those who don't know, who are you, Corey? What are just some of the things that you've been playing with? And I use that term appropriately, I think.
I'm a writer slash editor slash creative consultant. I've been primarily working in the games industry for about 23 years now. And I feel every year of that, every time I go out to a games industry social, because obviously it's a very young person's industry. I started off as a games journalist. Funnily enough, I wanted to be a games journalist since I was about 11 years old. And because this was the dark, distant past of the 1990s, there wasn't really a kind of like a real path to be able to get to become a games journalist or to get to become a fiction writer, which was the other thing that I wanted to kind of focus on. So I focused on becoming a journalist. So I studied a master's in journalism, and then through a stroke of luck or destiny or whatever you want to call it, a position on the place that I did kind of like a bit of part-time placement work at while I was doing my master's opened up just when I finished my degree. So I ended up getting straight into a job out of university, and then from there on, I kind of cascaded across the games industry. So I initially was working for a video game website that got bought by Yahoo. I worked with Yahoo for about a year. I left and freelanced for a variety of different gaming websites, but also started working on my own fiction at that point. Because the internet had become a thing. So it was actually easier to find out how to become a general writer, a general fiction writer. So I started writing my own comic books, being hired to write on graphic novels and so on and so forth. And then on the second year of my freelance career at that particular moment in time, things weren't going particularly well. So I thought, I'll just see if I can get a full-time job. And again, as luck, destiny would kind of make it, I ended up working for PlayStation because I did some freelance work for them during my first year. And that's where I stayed for 12 years, still working kind of like bits and pieces here and there. Primarily, I was working as a content producer slash editorial writer for PlayStation, working on like marketing materials and working with the developers of the games and product managers and kind of putting stuff on PlayStation.com and eventually PlayStation blog when that developed. The only reason really why I left PlayStation, because I was quite happy there for a long period of time, was one, I wanted to pursue a career in games narrative. And two, I actually started working on a game called Windrush Tales, which was originated by a very talented narrative designer, writer called Shella Ramanam, who currently works for Ubisoft. She finished working on the Avatar game last year. And she wanted to work on something which was reflective of her background, her Caribbean background.
For those who don't actually know what Windrush is it possible just to give a little bit of a background? Because I just want to put this here. I didn't know Corey was involved with the Windrush Tales, and I went to the British Library because they had an amazing digital storytelling exhibition on, and I played it there for the first time before I'd even met Corey. So again, this serendipity, and it was absolutely amazing. But for those who don't know, Corey, please explain.
So back in the 1950s, we call the Windrush generation 1950s to 1970s, but we'll specifically start in the 1950s. So we're talking post-World War II. And basically, Britain was in a bit of a state, obviously, from the war, and they put out a call to the Commonwealth. And the Caribbean is obviously a big part of the Commonwealth. And a lot of Caribbean people felt like Britain was very much like described as the motherland, essentially, a home away from home. The call out went out from Britain, from Britain's government and royalty, kind of basically saying, please come and help us rebuild the country. And so thousands and thousands of people from the Caribbean arrived on initially what was the ship, the Empire Windrush, hence the term the Windrush generation. And they came into the country to help rebuild the country, to help find jobs and basically craft new lives here in Britain. And as a result, what you had was a wave of immigration where people would either kind of tell stories of their friends and family back at home, back in the Caribbean, and say, hey, this is wonderful. It's amazing over here. You got to come over and kind of like help out and create a new life. Alternatively, they would make enough money and then head back to the Caribbean. My grandparents and my parents are part of that generation. They came over during the 60s, and that became my history and my heritage. So when we wanted to create a game around that, Shello was really adamant in terms of like wanting to be able to capture the culture, capture the challenges and the trials and the tribulations that that generation went through during that period of time. There's a lot of bigotry and racism and difficulty in getting jobs, all those things that they faced at the same time. But we also wanted to look at celebrating and uplifting the strength and everything that they brought to this country. You know, they changed the face of music, they changed the food, they changed all these different elements that we now very much can take for granted over here in the UK. Very much like any large amount of immigrant influx into a country, you get all that culture kind of integrating in there. And that's in itself is a wonderful thing and cause for celebration. So we wanted to be able to kind of look at that and create a game around that story, around that generation story, and kind of really look at the lives that they led, to a lot of kind of like, you know, talking to members of my family and kind of going through doing interviews, reading a lot of books, watching documentaries, all these things that contributed towards the creation of a game which is hopefully reflective and respectful of everything that they experienced.
Was that the most personal game that, even narrative, that you've ever been involved with? And how did you marry that degree of having to bring yourself into it, but also having to also have that objectivity, you know, because it's for an audience that isn't you.
I would be lying if I said it's easy. There's a great degree of pressure that we've put on ourselves to be able to reflect and respect effectively, you know, the people that are the reason why we're in this country, that we came to this country. And being able to examine that has been tricky. It is exceptionally personal, like you say. There's a level of being able to look at what they've gone through, and it kind of hurts to a certain degree when you hear some of the stories. During one of our workshops, we were talking to a relatively well-known Caribbean Windrush generation writer and journalist. He was part of our workshop, and we were very grateful to have him there because I'm friends with his son. We had all this feedback from him and other people, and my mum included, who was in one of the workshops. And when we came back and finished one of the second workshops, we were in such an emotional state because the gravity of what we were doing really hit home. It wasn't like we weren't aware of it before, but it was actually the first time that we had shown our game to people of that generation and was getting feedback from them directly. And it was such a powerful moment of, oh, wow, should we really be doing this? Because we really felt it. We felt that expectation that was there. Trying to distance ourselves from that is no easy thing either. You're trying to be, like you're saying, you're trying to have a level of objectivity there. But I think ultimately there's no way to remove yourself entirely from the experience and what you're writing and what you want to try and convey. I think if anything, it's being able to try and tap into that and use it a little bit, to help create a sense of authenticity and realism, of what they went through. We can never kind of portray what they've experienced because we can't travel back in time, obviously, but it's a sad indictment of where we are as a society that I can read my granddad's book. My granddad, basically my paternal granddad, had written like a little book of his experiences, right, when he came to the country, and I've been using that. Well, we've been using that as part of the research, and you can read some of the stuff he's gone through, and you notice a similarity to the sort of stuff that my parents have gone through, and that in reflection is also a similarity to the stuff that I've gone through, especially as a teenager, where I encountered a lot of racism. And sadly, like I can talk to my eldest niece and hear her stories about the racism that she's faced as a young teenager. And it's devastating. It's really hard to hear that. You know that this sort of thing is always going to be there. But ultimately you think, oh, at least things will improve and get better. But the same cycles are just repeating, not necessarily in the same ways, but they're repeating in ways which you see the similarities, and you see that level of bigotry, which is difficult to swallow. And so from my perspective, how I personally try to use it as a writer and as a person that is writing this game is that I take those personal experiences and I try to use them through the lens of the time period of that generation. The focus for me is always going to be the emotional impact. How does it feel to be in that circumstance? What is going through your mind? And if you can hone in on that, then personally, I feel that becomes more impactful than just trying to become a historical document, as it were, because I think people will relate to that more directly. People can watch a documentary, they can absorb these things from a distance in themselves if they want to. There's material out there, but for a game, I think it's important to be able to show that and convey, kind of show it to the player and convey it in a way which allows them to feel like they're experiencing it to a certain degree, a certain level of empathy that you're trying to kind of create. So it's really being able to kind of look at that and say, yeah, I may not have experienced that directly, but I can take those emotional elements that I can relate to and tap them and plug them into that and hopefully make that feel authentic and realistic.
If you were going back in time and talking to your 16-year-old self, in terms of the journey that you've taken, it's, you know, you're working in spaces, you're being in spaces where somebody like you, let's face it, underrepresented, wouldn't necessarily have been. You're working in gaming, which at one point perhaps was considered maybe a joke career, but it's actually very, very serious. It's big business. And so if you were talking to your 16-year-old self, like, what would you say to them about where you are now and everything that you've achieved? Because if I look at your paper bio, flipping hell, like, it is pretty amazing that you are where you are and everything that you've done, and you've been at the vanguard of so much. How would you tell your younger self, like, this is what you'll go on to do?
Thank you. This is actually, I'm a little bit emotional, and you'll probably hear that in my voice anyway, but this is actually quite a difficult question to answer in a certain degree, because earlier on this year, I was on the verge of quitting the games industry. I genuinely was like, I pretty much had enough. I'm freelancing at the moment. And I have been just for about a year and a half now. And things were really, really difficult in terms of getting work and trying to figure out exactly what the next steps are going to be. And you asking this question is a really great way to reflect on the journey of what I've gone through, because ultimately it's been such a long journey, and to be able to kind of speak to my 16-year-old self and go like, hey, there's got to be times where you're going to feel really jaded and feel like you're going to want to just quit, but it's going to be an incredible ride, because me as a 16-year-old didn't have the internet. The only way to be a video game journalist was to write for paper-based magazines, and that was relatively limited. And there was a couple TV shows like Games Master and Bad Influence and stuff like that were there, but you never really thought you could get to that particular point. It was always really about the writing of things. So to know now that, you know, yes, I have written for magazines, I've written for an entire different platform that didn't exist when I was 16 years old, because PlayStation didn't exist at the time. I've written officially for a platform for over a decade. I've written games, I'm writing comic books, I'm editing and writing children's books. I don't think my 16-year-old self would believe me. He'd think I would be taking the mickey out of him, and I wouldn't be able to comprehend that journey at all. I think when I was back then, it would just be like it was a straight path. It's like, I'd love to write books, I'd love to write comic books, I'd love to be in video games, and that's it. And as the world has changed and evolved, the horizons have changed and evolved as well, and allowed me to explore avenues which I didn't even know existed, and to go into places and be part of industries that I never thought I would be able to. You know, I'm lucky enough to be working on a film at the moment, and it's not my film, but I've been asked to be part of that film as a writer. And even like 4 years ago, I wouldn't have thought that would have been a case for me. I wouldn't be doing that. So I could turn around and tell to my 16-year-old self, and he would go, "You're definitely trying to take the mickey out of me now. You are having an absolute laugh." I'd blow his mind with kind of the opportunities that we would have been granted and kind of fought for. You've made me realize, like literally right now today, because I've not had an amazing day in myself. You made me realize that, like, I really should be extremely grateful for the path that I've taken and the opportunities I've been given. I wouldn't have been able to even fathom this career that I've had for 23 years. It would have been basically saying I've climbed Everest to my to my 16-year-old self. And it's like, no, how? That doesn't even make any sense. So, so yeah, it's strange.
Very easy to be our own critic. And I think when you're striving and isn't easy at all. And as soon as, we spoke, I was like, this is a dude. You embody the dudeness. And then, like, in terms of the writing, you've got beautiful writing, absolutely amazing. But it's the versatility that I don't understand how in this one person you have such versatility. You're doing a comic even at the moment, an open comic that anybody can come to, for which please talk to us more about. You, as you say, you're working on this film, you've got the games. Why is it important to have that?
So I mean, I'm lucky enough to be working on multiple different comic books, and I want to make sure I shout out the ones that I kind of primarily part of. First of Clockwork Watch, which is owned by a friend and writer called Yomi Ayeni, and that's a steampunk kind of thriller, essentially, which I edit. I started helping writing it, and then I kind of edit. And then there's also Magic and Myths, which is I work with my co-collaborator, co-creator, artist, Sergio Calvet, who lives in Barcelona. Amazing artist. Really, that's a story about me trying to find my own identity, really, through a young lady who's traveling through the world of Greek and Roman myth and why they're technically separate in this universe. But I think the comic book that we're kind of like touching upon is probably Deadlier Than. That one is definitely a exceptionally personal comic book because it's effectively an anthology of 4 stories. And those 4 stories are sci-fi, fantasy, a bit of spy thriller, a bit of fable, totally unrelated, with the exception of one current theme that runs through all of them. And that theme is me struggling with depression. I started writing this because I released it a good few years ago now. I started writing this when I was in the tinges of a long undiagnosed depression. And as I was going through it, I was writing more stories, not realizing that I was actually writing stories about my depression because they were, sci-fi stories, fantasy stories kind of thing. What I didn't realize until I was quite deep into them is that each story was representative of a different stage of my depression. That feeling of helplessness, that feeling of burden, the feeling of being trapped and betrayed by your own body and your own mind, the feeling of like society kind of abandoning you, and all these things kind of came out in the stories. It was one of those things where I finished writing all these stories and I was going through the rewriting and the editing process of them, and where I realized subliminally the earlier stories were about my depression. I realized that, and then when I realized that I was already writing about the depression throughout them, I made some tweaks to really kind of bring out that theme, to make sure that it was kind of more apparent in some areas as to what I was actually going through. And I worked with some absolutely phenomenal artists across the board, because each story has like a different artist essentially, or different art team, to be able to convey that. Because the story's initial concept was about female characters, and kind of I wanted to make sure that like a large majority of the art team were women. That was really one of the main themes of there. It wasn't like I understand what it's like to be a woman, or I was trying to convey what it's like to be a woman, but I wanted to put women in stories and spaces which I hadn't often seen within various parts of fiction. So I was really exploring that. But as it turned out, the level of exploration of my own depression became the connective tissue across all of them, that overridden the kind of like the part of me wanting to just kind of have like a effectively underrepresentation being shown through different genres. So yeah, it ended up being kind of like a very intense exploration of my experiences of mental health and the challenges of going through that.
And you've returned though, so that was a few years ago, but you're now publishing again. How would you describe it? You're now sharing it with the world. What's the actual process now?
So it's all published. It's all kind of, people can go out and buy the book. I am looking to kind of embellish this a little bit more as I go along. I'm working on a secret project to expand on that and really flesh out some of the ideas that I was looking at in the process of the comic book. But for me, in terms of like how I sort of think together, it's very much like I sit down, I can put the ideas down onto a page, and then I slowly kind of chisel out those ideas into a space where I feel there's a coherent story. and then being able to draw that story and the themes of what I want to say, what I want to explore, what I want to convey, and hopefully make them into something coherent, and then turn them into scripts, and then working those scripts through as much as possible, create something which I feel kind of captures those elements of what my themes are and what I want to try and kind of convey and such. And I go to conventions, and when I talk to people about these stories, I try to be as open as possible about the origins of them and what I was trying to convey with them, and the sort of morals and themes that are existent within them, because that's what people relate to. At the end of the day, that's what draws people to stories, a sense of commonality and universal kind of themes and elements we all experience or know someone that's experienced. So it's being able to kind of portray those really as best as possible.
I would love to know, what's your take then on things where artificial intelligence now plays a bit of a role, or things like ChatGPT, etc. Because I always have a little bit of a shudder when it comes to those sort of tools, and that's probably just me being a bit of a Luddite or something. But when you see that, do you ever think about, oh, but the beauty of the pain of the writing, what am I going to do with it? But what's your take on that in terms of those sort of tools?
I think I come from a place of skepticism when it comes to AI. They're fun little tools, I think, for people to use. I always look with a bit of side eye on people that are using them to create stories. Now, that isn't to say that these things should never be done. I'm not keen on them, don't get me wrong. For me, AI is a tool in a certain way, and it's a tool which has been misused. Also, I feel like there's a marketing bubble around it as such, because everything is now AI. It's just like the fact that predictive text is technically AI. And people will say like, oh, we've introduced this new AI into like a vacuum cleaner. It's just like, well, it's the same vacuum cleaner from 10 years ago. It's just that you've called this filtration system AI now because that's what everybody uses as a way of describing something which is ever so slightly intelligent. The problem with AI, and I think the issue with how people see it when they try to use it as a creation tool, is that AI cannot think. It's very easy to feel like it can think, but it cannot make decisions in the same way that a human can make decisions. It can take as much information as possible and predict and make what it feels like an informed choice based on that input, but it cannot make a discerning choice. This is the reason why we're getting so many kind of like really wild things, like be it people putting in like how to make pizza, and they're getting recipes with glue for their pizzas, because the AI can't discern what is, in this particular case, a important factor of what it is to cook, which is to say, we try to put ingredients in to create the food, but we also try to make it healthy. AI is not be able to make that decision as to what is healthy and what isn't, because it doesn't know. The only thing it's got is a definition in a dictionary that it can refer to. And so when we come to the creation of stories, one of the fundamental parts is creativity. Where does creativity and imagination come from? It comes from all different types of experiences and sources, but it comes from living. It comes from experiencing life. We can get ideas just by walking out into a road and looking at everything around us, and come back and write about that and look through the lens of our history, our background, everything that we've gone through as a person. AI doesn't have that. It does not have that at all. You can tell it to replicate what it may feel like to be in this case, a middle-aged black man who's a writer, but it wouldn't be able to give you the experience of that. It wouldn't be able to tell you like the fear of what it's like to walk into a pub and the whole pub just stop and look at you. It wouldn't be able to tell you what it's like to hold a baby in your hands and then be introduced to your first niece. It wouldn't be able to tell you what it's like to be asked to become a godparent. It can only tell you what is in raw information that exists. And so as writers, it's very easy to feel threatened by AI, but ultimately it can never replicate those sorts of things. And until it can, which is a very, very long way away. I know AI is progressing at this point, but it's going to be a long time before it can replicate a human experience, because these things are not alive. They are intelligent, but they're not alive. And that's the fundamental difference. It's not going to be able to pull in the things which make us alive, which make us human. And those are where the sources and the kind of springs of creativity and imagination come from, which make writing and fiction worthwhile in itself. In the same way that, there's artwork, which, you can look at it and say, oh my God, it looks really close to what a human person would create. But the source of inspiration will never be the same. And ultimately, the AI won't be able to create, because it's always taking its cues from everything else that's around it. I spend a long time thinking about this sort of thing. I think it's like my first response to AI kind of taking the strikes that it has was to kind of be a bit worried and be concerned and think, oh my God, this is terrible. And I still think it's terrible, and I still feel a sense of threat from that. But I'm reassured through the eyes of the fact that we as human beings, our experiences are going to be very difficult to fully replicate in a meaningful way that AI can replicate. And that is ultimately what we're wanting, despite the fact that obviously some studios will just churn out the same cookie cutter stuff all the time. but that's by the by, really. Ultimately, there's diminishing returns that come with that. So yeah, it's scary times, but I do feel there's a sense of hope that we can still cling on to.
And that was Corey Brotherson. Do you have an interdisciplinary life? Because I would love to hear from you, and maybe we can chat on this podcast that goes with my newsletter, which is called Have You Thought About, and can be found via www.druthishah.com. Please join me next time for a fun conversation with another guest who likes to mix up lots of things in their life. Do listen to past episodes and rate and review the podcast if you've enjoyed it. Thank you to Rian Shah for the music.